Well, good morning. I've been asked to speak to three questions relating to solar radiation management techniques. And the questions are, under what conditions can you imagine proceeding with field testing and eventual deployment of SRM? What are the most challenging ethical issues that SRM presents? And what steps should be immediately taken to address these challenges? I'm just going to go through them sequentially to lay out some of the issues involved. On the first question about research into including field testing of SRM technologies and potential future deployment, it's important to begin by differentiating the different types of field tests that could be done with SRM technologies. So putting it practically, with SRM technologies, you're injecting particles into the atmosphere. If you're talking about cloud whitening, you're injecting saltwater particles or potentially other particles into the troposphere, which is the clouds, in order to see what impact they have on brightening clouds and on, therefore, reflecting sunlight away from the planet. Alternatively, with stratospheric aerosols, you're injecting particles up above the cloud banks into the stratosphere, where they form basically a very fine mist, small reflective particles that scatter light and reflect some of it back into space to cool the planet down. And there are two different types of field tests one can imagine to begin with. The first type of field experiment is a process experiment, an experiment to test how well you can actually deploy particles or disperse particles. This doesn't actually require doing it at a very large scale. One can imagine doing it with a very small number of particles, in this case maybe kilograms to tons of material, that you would spray either into the clouds or up into the stratosphere to just see how particles form. What sort of spray nozzles do you need to use? At what altitude do you need to inject it to get the type of particles you want? Can you do it with planes? Can you do it with balloons? There's a bunch of process tests. These are small enough that they would have no noticeable impact on the climate system and virtually no environmental impacts. You'd want to do an environmental impact study first, but it doesn't require a huge amount because the volume is just so small of material you put in, much smaller than is put in by a small city or town these days, never mind an entire country. That's different from experiments, from field tests that you would do to try and see how the climate responds. In order to see how the climate responds to an SRM technology, you have to do something pretty big. Now, Mount Pinatubo in 1991 was a very big natural experiment. That's bigger than would be necessary in order to test how, for example, precipitation patterns would respond to blocking out a bit of sunlight, but it's still notably bigger than process experiments. So under what conditions could I imagine doing process experiments? Well, the requirements in my mind for that are much lower. First, I would want to make sure that the experiments being done are entirely transparent, that these aren't being done in secret or by corporate interests trying to protect intellectual property on these technologies. But at the same time, it's not the same as running an experiment that's going to have major impacts on other countries. I think personally, I would want other countries to be aware of and involved in discussions about the type of process experiments to run, about the types of technologies we're going to test and develop. But there doesn't necessarily need to be broad international consent. When you start talking about scales of climate impact testing, for that, actually, I think it absolutely requires some form of international decision. The type of which, the structure of which, and the body that should make those decisions, those are questions that need a lot more exploration. And actually, there are initiatives out there, for example, the SRM governance initiative being led by the Royal Society of the United Kingdom, the academies of science of the developing countries, and the Environmental Defense Fund. This SRM governance initiative is a panel of experts, 20 to 30 people from around the world. I'm one of them. Other members participating in this event here are among them. But we'll begin to explore some of these issues of how you actually set up the governance. But it's not an easy question. The other part of this first question on deployment, though, that's even more challenging. The question is, under what conditions could I imagine eventual deployment happening? Well, there are two broad categories I would lay out. The first one is actually the one that I hope doesn't happen, which is SRM gets deployed because some group of people, however small or large, begin to panic about the climate system, begin to get concerned that we are in a climate emergency and something needs to be done. And therefore it leads to a rapid attempt to deploy, possibly without enough scientific evidence. Examples of this could include everything from the methane starting to outgas a lot of carbon, and the world gets concerned about a runaway greenhouse effect, or at least not runaway like the Venus effect, but runaway enough that it would dramatically increase the amount of warming that we've already seen. In that case, I could imagine the world coming together quickly, cobbling something together, and trying to do the best we could to stem off further methane releases. But equally plausible are countries impacted by massive floods or massive droughts that begin to get attributed to climate change, for example, the floods in Pakistan, as just a beginning of what could be coming down the pipe, that it could lead to everything from political instability to small coalitions of countries beginning to come together and say, we're facing an existential threat from climate change and we need to do something. That can lead to a lot of international political tension, a lot of international political challenges that I think ideally we'll try and avoid. But it's hard to see, again, going back to this question of what governance institutions are necessary, it's hard to see an easy path on governing. Now, there is the possibility that we go down the other path, which is beginning to have a broad international discussion with engagement of a lot of different populations and policymakers, leading towards a rational governance structure to make decisions collectively about the type of climate we want to have and how we're going to go about managing that climate. And in this case, it's not just about managing geoengineering or managing SRM. It's about managing our emissions of CO2, of other things we emit anthropogenically into the climate, from methane to black carbon to sulfur, that all have an impact on shaping the radiative balance of the entire planet. You want to have all of those things in a rational management framework. And as we've seen from the UNFCCC, as we've seen from the lack of progress on even talking about just carbon emissions, this is not a trivial undertaking to form that sort of a management framework. And that actually leads into what I personally believe is the biggest ethical challenge with SRM. SRM gives a small group of people the ability to impact everybody's climate. And already the development of technologies throughout the 19th and 20th century led to fairly large, but still only a fraction of the world, these groups of people, like in the developed countries, developing emission profiles that have large impacts on everybody's climate. To say that a slightly better way, we've already developed technologies that allow a smallish group of people to have a big impact on everybody's climate. And we haven't managed those technologies very well. And those in the least developed countries, particularly small island developing states, are the most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change while being the least responsible for the emissions to date. The biggest ethical challenge for SRM, from my perspective, is developing a framework of governance and engagement that allows those populations which are most vulnerable and therefore often overlapping with the poorest and often overlapping with the most disenfranchised from international governance structures, developing a framework that allows those vulnerable populations to have a large impact on the decisions that are made with these technologies over when and how SRM is developed, tested, and deployed or not. It's a set of ethical questions that go along with questions of international governance and the role of democracy and how you begin to have a democratic process on global issues when you have many countries that don't have fully democratic processes. And even in the countries that you do, those are often the ones that are most gridlocked on figuring out what to do with climate change and with the management of our climate system. So it's not only an ethical, but a practical governance challenge. But again, to drive it home, it's getting the most vulnerable engaged in the decision-making process. Finally, what steps should be taken from my point of view to immediately address this? The nearest term objective is to broaden the engagement, broaden the number of, particularly in this case, policymakers at high levels of government and civil society, and very importantly, civil society, not only in developed countries, but also in emerging and developing countries, so that there is, at least among the decision-making community, an understanding of the types of technologies that are coming, about the sorts of decisions that they will need to be taking within 5 to 10 years, and should actively push for engagement in. If developing country decision makers don't know that decisions are being taken on SRM, that leads to the ethical challenge. So an engagement and education process is first and foremost the next step in my mind. A broader engagement in terms of broad populace education on geoengineering, on SRM in particular, does need to come, but I think that also needs to be accompanied with a broader engagement and understanding of the impacts of climate change and how greenhouse gas-induced climate change is going to be impacting these populations, so that they have a better understanding of the risks that they're currently facing and can therefore begin to comprehend and understand the types of risks that SRM would add on to and possibly reduce if SRM technologies were to be developed and deployed. So to summarize, the key messages are there's two different types of field testing out there. There's procedure type, process type testing at a low scale, large scale testing of the climate. I think process experiments need a much lower threshold of international engagement than climate impact testing. Deployment can go one of two ways. It can go in the direction of waiting until we're in a panic mode, or a small group or a large group are in panic mode, and beginning to deploy out of fear of the consequences, which isn't ideal, or beginning to take a more holistic management approach to the climate system, which doesn't just focus on carbon or just expand into aerosols, but actually begins to ask questions about what sort of climate balance we may want to have in different places. The ethical challenge is getting vulnerable populations engaged. It's a practical ethical challenge because of how hard it is to engage those populations. And the immediate steps are education and engagement, particularly for policymakers in developing and emerging economies. Thank you very much.